We are now live.
Good morning and welcome to our monthly instructor webinar. Today we're just excited to talk about how to prepare for an OSHA inspection. And I think you'll find this valuable information because what we'll be discussing will be not only applicable to OSHA, but also to any of your customers that might want to come and review your HSE programs and systems. So in that regard, what we're going to be discussing today will help you prepare for both of those things for sure. And before we get started today, as always, we have a little bit of housekeeping we like to discuss, and this is true for certainly the new folks on the phone today. We'll be sending out the recording of this event to you via email after the webinar. Submit your questions anytime. We'll answer those at the end of the webinar. And please participate in polling, and we'll share those results as well at the end of the event. Our agenda today is, of course, the introduction, the top 10 OSHA citations. Probably some of you all know those. And asking the question, are you ready for an inspection or an audit? So facility escort guidelines, key, very important. Site inspection tips, closing conference, training course, and then questions. So today we are lucky enough to have James Junkins with us. As you can see, James is a CSP. He's also a safety management specialist and has a certified safety and health official designation from OSHA. He's been a Veriforce master trainer for over 10 years. He's president of Merida Gulf and Consulting Services. And Merida does a number of things, but what they really like to work on is helping their clients in their EH&S development and implementation of management systems. And James and his company have clients in construction, maritime, heavy industry, oil and gas. So what James is going to be discussing, you can feel very confident in that he's been there, done that, and will be here to help you and answer questions. So James, we're going to turn this over to you, but just one more thing before we do. One of the things that we've heard from our instructors is they'd like some updates. So coming out very soon, probably this week, will be our first instructor newsletter. And we hope to do this probably on a quarterly basis just to keep you updated on things that we know about happening in the industry and things that would be important to you as an instructor. So James, if you would, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Mr. P. Today, we'll begin with the top 10 OSHA citations for fiscal year 2020. So, again, thank you for allowing me to participate in this webinar, and thank you for joining us in this webinar on how to prepare for an OSHA inspection. Now, while the pandemic slowed OSHA inspections down both as a national policy and due to the closure of many businesses, 2020 still saw over 20,000 inspections conducted with over 75,000 citations with penalties issued at both the state and the federal level. Our sources within federal OSHA indicate that the Biden administration intends to return to the levels of between 35,000 and 40,000 inspections for 2021. For reference and in comparison, the Obama administration had as many as 92,000 inspections annually. And so the number of inspections are expected to rise, and this will include the National Emphasis Program that many have heard about regarding COVID-19, despite OSHA not having a specific standard. And although that emergency standard is still very much under consideration. The latest data computed through the end of 2020 shows that since the inception of the pandemic, OSHA has levied more than $4 million in COVID-related fines to companies operating in the United States. So today our purpose is to provide you some tools to better prepare for an OSHA inspection. I'd like to begin by reviewing the top 10 most commonly cited OSHA violations for the fiscal year 2020. And as we look at this list, I'd like for you to think about a situation perhaps in your own company or your own facility, and if you would have the potential for a violation among any of these. Statistically, the ranking of these common areas does not change much annually. The number one violation, fall protection, has held that distinctive rank for the past 10 years. Between 2019 and 2020, the top 10 violations did not change, although multiple standards swapped positions from 2019. For example, ladders climbed into a top 5 spot. Respiratory protection, no surprise here, rose from 5th to 3rd. HAZCOM citations largely centered around employee training. Respiratory violations usually relate to training, not providing annual fit tests, that kind of thing. Scaffold use and inspection and ladders rounded out the top 5. So I can speak from experience as an auditor for Veriforce that these are the most common opportunities for improvement. Problems within the written programs, problems with training, and issues related to field execution. So what I'd like to discuss now is how prepared are you for OSHA to knock at the door? And that brings us to our first poll question. Are you prepared for an OSHA inspection? I see the data coming in. And frankly, I'm not surprised that the majority of the respondents to the poll said somewhere between B and C. The thought of the regulatory body descending upon our businesses unannounced with the power to fine and penalize the company can be unnerving. Now, while most of those participating in this webinar are safety professionals by trade, little education is offered either by OSHA or by the various professional training courses that we've taken on how to deal with the legal aspects of occupational safety and health. So one of the first steps in preparation that I can recommend is on the next slide. Here you'll see our first recommendation. If you are the person responsible for coordinating your company's response in an OSHA inspection, the first recommendation I can make is for you to read OSHA's Field Operation Manual, CPL 02-00-164. To make it easier for you, I've included the FOM as a download for this webinar. Those of you who've read it in the past, you might want to view the latest edition, which came out in April of 2020. The Field Operations Manual is designed to give guidance from Washington to the OSHA area offices and state programs on the policies and procedures related to inspection and enforcement. In this document, you're going to find what the rights of OSHA are regarding enforcement activities. And if you don't wish to read the entire manual, please look to Chapter 3, which speaks to the inspection procedures. The more you know, the better prepared you will be. Included in this document will be the details concerning the opening conference, documents that may be requested by OSHA, by the compliance officer, including OSHA Forms 300, 300A, training records, the company's policies and procedures, the walk-around inspection, how OSHA intends to conduct interviews with employees and management, and the closing conference. Now, we're going to touch on some of these areas in the webinar, but time will not permit us to go through and conduct a thorough examination, which is why we provided the download. Preparation is key. As with anything in life, success is determined by preparation. If you're prepared, you shouldn't have to worry about OSHA knocking at your door. And that's what we're going to be discussing for the rest of the webinar, how to prepare. One of the first things that we at Mariner Gulf recommend is for you to form a committee. The committee makeup should consist of numerous different people and not just the occupational safety and health team. Now, further expanding on the list in the slide, I would recommend a representative from the various departments within your company. I know that attending this webinar, we have a lot of different companies, many related to the oil and gas industry and others from different sectors. So this list is not all inclusive. Other departments, other people may be necessary to round out the committee and give full representation. This will greatly help in preparing for the inspection. For example, if the compliance officer asks about ventilation at the facility, you as the safety professional may not be the best person to answer that question. That should come from facilities or maintenance personnel that are the resident experts in that area. This committee can also serve as the escort committee. These are individuals within your organization that may be involved during the inspection. By forming a committee ahead of time, they can be well prepared. You'll also want to organize all of your internal resources, and that includes figuring out what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. It's too late at 8 a.m. on a Friday when the receptionist at your company calls to tell you that OSHA is in the lobby. This is especially important regarding logistics and planning, such as how are you going to escort the compliance officer through your facility? What if the compliance officer comes in for one specific complaint that someone may have? Everyone asks, how do we get inspected by OSHA? The most common way to get inspected by OSHA is employee complaint. I had one for a client just last month. An employee complained to OSHA that there were bed bugs in his vehicle, okay, which resulted in an inquiry. Being employee complaint driven, OSHA's inspection should focus on that area alone unless you open the door for a wider inquiry. When that happens, and to keep OSHA from wandering through your facility and turning a focused inspection into a broader, examination, what is the plan? If you take OSHA on a grand tour of your facility and job site and violations are in plain sight, then that is fair game for the compliance officer to issue a citation. With regards to roles and responsibilities, whom in your company is going to take the lead? Who is going to sit in on the opening conference and the closing conference? These are the things that you will want to organize well in advance. If you establish a committee and not delegate the entire responsibility to the EH&S department, this will help you organize and be prepared to facilitate the opening conference. The opening conference is your opportunity for your company to demonstrate to the compliance officer how well your occupational safety and health program is planned and implemented. You want to show them how organized you are and that you're ready to proceed. Relevant personnel should be available. Documentation should be available and readily retrievable. You don't want to take hours to locate things like OSHA 300 logs, policies and procedures, training records, and the like. This gives a very poor impression to the compliance officer and starts the inspection on the wrong foot. Secondly, the preparedness committee can establish the inspection schedule with the compliance officer. How long do they anticipate being there? I know of some inspections, particularly those related to serious injuries and fatalities, that have lasted over a month. Establishing a timeline ensures that you have the right people available to the compliance officer when needed. Next, you'll want to coordinate the inspection with different department and operations managers. Now, every company is different when it comes to work shifts and tasks. So you want to establish what you're doing and when you're doing it with the compliance officer so they know what you're doing and when you're doing it. OSHA understands that, people go on vacation and that operational issues arise. So you'll want to be proactive with the compliance officer and plan this out ahead of time and during the opening conference. Now, I highly recommend that during the inspection that you conduct daily debriefings. Again, in the planning stage, you need to decide who's going to attend, what you're going to discuss, how you're going to record the information that is discussed, and what actions will be taken. This is very, very important. Findings may occur during the day, and you may want to clean some of that up, some of those issues up, so that you can demonstrate to the compliance officer that their concerns were immediately remediated. Lastly, the committee will want to organize the closing conference. Who from the company needs to attend? You'll always want to have a high-ranking corporate officer to attend the closing conference. This should be decided well ahead of time. That individual, the president, the vice president, director, etc., should be prepared by the committee as to what the expectations are and their role is in the closing conference. One of the best ways to prepare for an OSHA inspection is to have a written policy and procedure. Most companies that we've run across do not have such a document or plan. This plan should reflect some of the key points that we're recommending in this webinar, but be customized to your organization. So to assist you in planning, the technical writing team at Mariner Gulf has provided a free download for attending this webinar, a policy that we've entitled Regulatory Agency Inspection, and it's meant for you to take and customize for your organization if you so desire. So the next poll question, very simple. Does your company have a written procedure and policy for an open OSHA inspection? All right, the data is coming in, and it's not surprising. So I highly recommend that you get a written procedure, a policy procedure in place. Moving on to facility inspector escorts. Now, the individuals that you have decided that will be the escorts for the compliance officer should also be trained. It is imperative that those designated to be with the inspector on the walk around be knowledgeable and understand how to answer questions and how not to answer questions. In my experiences, the inspector tries to become very friendly with the escorts, and that's when the escorts slip up and start sharing information that perhaps they should not share. Everyone on the escort team needs to understand the severity of being inspected. Nothing is off the record. Another key quality of an escort is understanding how to intercede if and when the compliance officer asks leading questions. Sometimes compliance officers can ask leading questions to employees to get them to try to answer a predetermined response. For example, compliance officer might say, "Isn't it true that your company has not trained you?" That's your opportunity to get in and intercede. The last bullet point is very important. If the compliance officer asks a specific question about a specific task or hazard at the facility or job site, the escort should direct the compliance officer to someone who is qualified to answer the question. Now, every company has specific language that it uses. For example, JHA, JRA, JSEA instead of JSA. A good escort can interpret what the compliance officer is saying and restate the question in a language that employees routinely use. For example, if the compliance officer says, "Do you complete JSAs prior to beginning work?" and the employee answers, "We don't use JSAs," the escort should intervene and say, "What the compliance officer is asking about is our JHA process." That way, employees understand exactly what the compliance officer's question is. And I highly recommend the escorts be trained on this because OSHA often speaks in a very regulatory way that employees are unfamiliar with. Next, we'll review some of the site inspection tips that, if employed, should reduce the likelihood of your company being cited by OSHA, and if cited, reduce the severity and the penalty. I highly recommend that after this webinar, you go back to your companies and gather the documentation that OSHA most likely is going to request and assemble, and have it where it is easily retrievable. At the same time, it'd be a good idea to put in place a system of verifying your information. Now, I'm going to speak more to that as we close out this webinar. But one of the things that I want to point out is, once the opening conference is concluded, most likely the compliance officer is going to say, show me your written programs. Now, this is where companies often get into trouble. They only have written programs as requested by the third-party verification systems such as Veriforce, ISN, ComplyWorks, and Avetta. Those requests may not be comprehensive based on all the work that your company performs. So look for gaps in your written programs and develop those that you are missing. Now, having your written documentation house in order is very important. OSHA is not going to wait weeks for you to assemble your documentation. And I say weeks because in some of the audits I've conducted for Veriforce, we ask for similar documentation, such as OSHA 300 logs, policies and procedures, training records, inspection records, and the likes. And sometimes it takes companies weeks to gather this material. To be prepared, you need to locate the required documentation and make sure that documentation is up to date and that it reflects your current practices. This is the number one thing that I find and that OSHA finds, that plans have been written, but they have not been touched in 5, 10, 15 plus years. So just because you're graded green in a third-party verification system such as Compliance Pro does not necessarily mean that you're good to go in the eyes of OSHA. The longer the compliance officer has to wait for you to assemble the documentation, the greater the impression is that you're not very organized. You want to present to OSHA that you are prepared, you are organized, and you are ready to go. If you cannot produce something in a timely manner, okay, fine. You need to let the compliance officer know. And that should be really part of the duty of your preparedness committee, to ascertain who has the documents. For larger companies, I recommend that you create a list of who has what documentation, and that list is something that you might want to share with the compliance officer so that he or she can know where to direct specific questions. So I've shared also with you as a downloadable document, I mentioned it before, the beginnings of a company-specific preparedness plan. Take a look at the document and use it to create a program that is specific to your organization. This is something you don't have to share with the compliance officer, but it's something that you would want to share internally with relevant parties so that everyone knows what their roles and responsibilities are related to the inspection. You'll only want to assemble and give to the compliance officer the materials that he or she is requesting. Do not give OSHA documentation that they have not requested. If you do so, you're going to expand the inspection. If they have not requested your lockout tagout program, do not provide it to them. This will open a new inquiry that you may not be prepared for. For example, OSHA may be there because of an employee complaint regarding training associated with forklifts. If you give them your lockout tagout policy, then you've opened yourself up for them to examine the training of lockout tagout, as well as the annual evaluation of individual procedures and the effectiveness of your program, which, based on my experience as an auditor, you're probably not doing. Do not use your own office or any office to conduct the records review as part of the examination. Find the conference room and use that. I have a friend who used his office for the records review during an OSHA inspection. The OSHA inspector said, man, this is great. You're showing me like 15 years worth of documentation. My friend said, but you only asked for 3 years. The compliance officer said, yeah, but you showed me 15 years. So now I can look at anything. Never do that. If OSHA makes copies of something, you should make copies. This can be of great use during the closing conference. The compliance officer may say, you failed to produce this documentation, and you can correctly respond, no, it's right here in the documents that we copied as we produced them to you. And this is especially helpful if you receive a notice of violation and proposed penalty in the mail. You will have the exact duplicate copies of the documentation that you provided. I also recommend that you record every document that you provide to OSHA. The document, the date, the time, and what the request was made for. Now, back in the beginning, when we discussed communications, when OSHA shows up, are you going to be like Paul Revere running through the company, the British are coming, the British are coming? Or do you have a communication system in place? Part of your preparedness plan should be creating a system of communication that alerts management and those that are in the area of the walk around to prepare for the inspection. It should already have been decided who's going to be the primary speaker for the company at the opening conference. Is it going to be top management, or is it going to be the senior safety representative? Things you should consider. Do you have a site-specific safety orientation that the inspector needs to attend prior to conducting the inspection? I highly recommend that you go over the safety requirements that you have as a company for anyone that enters the facility or job site with a compliance officer. In the past, I've seen companies that have, very elaborate safety presentations and site-specific orientations that failed to have the compliance officer participate. At the end of the day, the compliance officer comes back and cites the company because the company did not detail their program. At that point, it's too late to show them your site-specific after they have conducted the inspection. Figure out your schedule. Make sure you consider lunch breaks, afternoon and morning breaks, critical work activities, so that everyone is on the same page. Another often overlooked but critical area is debriefing each party that was inspected or interviewed. You'll want to go back to those different groups after the fact and ask if they have any questions or concerns regarding the process. All right, during the opening conference, as I stated earlier, you really want to outline a willingness to work with OSHA, and then you want to show them all the great things that are happening with regards to safety within your organization. Now, don't try to give them any unnecessary information. Don't say, we know we have some issues and we're working on things. Allow the compliance officer to direct you in what he or she wants to see. Discuss with OSHA, how important compliance is for your organization and the safety of your employees. Talk about how involved top management is in your safety program. Again, they may have heard that stated 1,000,000 times, but if it's part of your process, that's going to be helpful during the inspection. Sometimes if OSHA feels like you're on top of things and something small comes up, they might mention it, but not cite you for it, particularly if you can fix it quickly. Make sure that you have top management, upper management involved in the inspection. Part of the inspection is to verify top management's ownership of the occupational safety and health program. If they're not involved in the opening conference, sometimes that looks bad as well. Now, one of the most important things to find out early on is why OSHA is there. What is the scope of the inspection? What is the most important thing that the inspector's looking for? Is it a multimedia inspection where OSHA is coming in and they're looking at everything? Or is OSHA there for a specific task, such as a national emphasis program for things like COVID-19 compliance, excavation and trenching, silica? This is extremely important so that when you're escorting compliance officers on their walkthrough, that you only take them to the areas in which the inspection is intended. The scope can only broaden then if you open the door and violations are in plain sight. So don't give them a general overview of everything. Keep the inspection tight and to the reason for the inspection. Once you have established why OSHA is there, you'll want to make sure that you accompany each inspector at all times. Don't let the inspector freely roam through your facility and your job site unaccompanied. Be cooperative, but don't offer any information that they have not requested. As I've already mentioned, but I want to make sure for emphasis that you understand the importance. Duplicate every document that is given to OSHA or that is copied by OSHA. Make sure that you take good notes, especially at the end of the day. So what I like to do is at the end of the day, is go over my notes with the entire escort team. Okay, this is what I heard. What did you hear? This is what I saw. What did you see? This is what I understood. What did you understand? Are we on the same page? If OSHA asks to take pictures, you should take pictures and from the same angle. If they ask to take samples, then you should take samples at the same time and in the same type of containers. You don't want any questions on the other end of this inspection. And you'll want to monitor your employee interviews to the extent that is possible. You'll want to conduct exit interviews for each area observed by the inspector to discover what did the compliance officer find. If you see the compliance officer writing a lot of notes, I'd be like, okay, can I just ask you what you're writing those notes on? Is that something I should be aware of, or is it just general information based on the facility? This is always good to know because you don't want to be surprised later when the letter comes in the mail from the area office. This allows you to start planning ahead of time for potential corrective actions. Of note on this slide, it is very, very important to stay with the inspector. Inspectors will wander off while you're having a side conversation and can lead themselves into a dangerous situation such as a confined space, a restricted area, walk underneath suspended loads, etc. Because you did not tell them not to, or more importantly, they may end up in an area that you did not want them to go. So everyone in the escort group needs to take good notes during and after the interview, ask questions, and stay with the compliance officer. If you cannot answer a question, make sure to make note of it and tell the compliance officer when you will get back to him or her with the answer to the question. You don't want to leave the impression that you're blowing OSHA off on the question, but that you'll get them the answer and when you will get them the answer. As issues are found during the inspection, if you can correct them immediately, you need to do so. Any OSHA inspector will tell you that if you correct it immediately, that it may not end up in the final report. Now, that doesn't mean that it won't, but there's great potential that because you were proactive, that it doesn't, especially if it was something minor. That's why I recommend that your policies and procedures be in an immediately editable format so you can correct identified deficiencies immediately. Even if it ends up in the final report, the report will note that you corrected it the day of the inspection, and that demonstrates a positive and proactive attitude by the company. If you cannot correct it while OSHA is on site during the inspection, but you can correct it before OSHA returns the next day, you'll want to point that out to the inspector when he or she arrives that you've corrected the identified problem, whatever issues are, and what your mitigation plan was. Hopefully, because you immediately corrected the issue that was pointed out by the compliance officer, that it doesn't make it into the final report for citation and penalty. Also important, behind the scenes, you want to make sure that everyone in your company knows where the inspectors are throughout the day. That means you have to plan your communication strategy in advance. It could be cellular, it could be text, it could be radio. Everyone needs to know where the inspectors are in the facility or the job site. I have seen companies literally stop all operations during the inspection. Now, some compliance officers do not like that because they can't see what's going on. But OSHA cannot force you to work. Now, I'm not suggesting that's a good idea, just simply saying that's what some people do. The point is, you want to know, and everyone in your organization to know, you want everyone to know where the inspectors are so that you do not have unnecessary personnel wandering into the area of the inspection. You don't want an employee not involved in the operation to come walking through the area missing his hard hat or safety glasses, for example. So limit the activities in the area of the inspection if you can. Moving on to the closing conference. This is the most important meeting in the entire process, the closing conference. This is where you're an understanding of how the inspection went. You may want to have a senior executive present and potentially your attorney. I highly recommend that you have an attorney that specializes in dealing with occupational safety and health issues if the inspection is one that is associated with a serious injury or fatality, or if you feel the inspection has gone really bad. Make sure that you present any documentation of corrective actions that you have taken for identified issues during the inspection. Now, while it's a great idea, like I recommended earlier, to do that on a daily basis, you'll want to present that as a total package in the closing conference. This is your last chance to influence or change the compliance officer's mind prior to the written report. If you have answers to questions posed by the compliance officer that you cannot answer in the field, now is the time to close those open items out. Again, I've said this multiple times. Take good notes. Do not attempt to deal with hypothetical situations. Say, I have a friend that has this issue. Look, OSHA's heard it all before, and the inspector does not want to hear that. The first bullet is an important one. Do not offer an opinion or agree nor disagree with the compliance officer. The absolute worst thing you want to do is to have an argument with the inspector. That is most likely not going to go over very well. It's good to talk about sports and things to try and lighten the mood. Don't try to be the compliance officer's buddy. Nothing is off the record. Obviously, do not sign anything. Keep the inspector from harm's way. This goes back to what we talked about earlier. Do not allow the compliance officer to walk off on their own and just sort of wander. They may or may not know that they are entering a high hazard area. And the worst outcome for you is for the inspector to get injured or to be involved in a near miss. Some more guidelines. Do not offer information to the inspector unless you are specifically asked. Do not provide more information thinking it's going to help your cause. We all complain about regulations, but the compliance officer's not going to hear that from you. So no complaining about governmental overreach. If you don't know, say you don't know, but don't be pushed into giving answers that you're unsure of. It's okay to tell the inspector you don't know and that you need to speak to someone else to get the answer. Don't be evasive. Answer the questions directly and in a manner of fact. Make sure that you provide a full answer. Most importantly, do not lie to the compliance officer. Lying can lead to serious penalties. Finally, do not engage in speculation. Again, I cannot stress this enough. If you don't know the answer or you're unsure of the answer, Be forthright with the compliance officer and get the answer from the right personnel. All this is about being prepared. Choosing the right people to speak to the compliance officers ahead of time is one of the most important parts in all of this. Now, one of the most common areas where companies fail during an inspection is in the area of training. As most of you know, we're finding training to be a daunting task for some companies. And it's one of the most cited areas in the audits that we're conducting for Veriforce. The same is true for OSHA inspections. Ensuring that all of your employees are properly trained based on the job task and hazards employees are exposed to should be something that everyone on this call goes back and reviews. Just saying, well, my operator, my hiring client only requires us to have safe land will not suffice in an OSHA inspection. So here, and in the following slides, I have listed out all the OSHA regulations that require training. And when you see the list, indeed, it is daunting. Now, for some of you, these will not apply to your company, but for many, several will. And it's important that you know that each one of these is required by law. All of the OSHA required training and what is entailed can be found in a 270-page OSHA publication called OSHA Pub 2254, which I have provided as a download as part of this presentation. And I encourage you to download that information. Okay. I highly recommend that you develop a written training matrix with employee job task descriptions on which these regulations that each employee is required to be trained on. Many have OSHA required annual refreshers, such as occupational noise and respiratory protection. These are easy citations for OSHA to issue. Everyone needs some things like emergency action plans. Are we training on those? PPE. There's one. Have employees been trained on how to don and doff and the limitations of the PPE that they use, etc.? Have you completed a job hazard analysis to determine what PPE is required? Have you completed the 1910-132-D2 written hazard certification? Lockout, tagout. Have you trained your authorized employees on lockout, tagout procedures? Never mind the other part of the standard that requires the company to verify equipment-specific procedures on an annual basis. Are you conducting annual fire extinguisher training? Just about every facility has fire extinguishers. Can you provide documentation that all affected workers have been trained? Powered industrial truck training, forklift training requires classroom, hands-on, and an operational evaluation, as well as an additional evaluation at least every 3 years. Do you have that documentation for those operators? If you're using slings for hoisting, some states require a hoisting license, and federal OSHA requires that employees be trained on how to inspect the slings and that training has to be documented. This slide probably is not going to apply to most of you that are participating in this webinar, so we'll move on to the next one. Electrical safety. Everyone who uses extension cords needs to be trained on that. Daisy chaining of electrical cords is not allowed. Do you have documentation that you've trained affected workers on how to inspect cords and plugs? Those are legally required training items. Then we get into chemical hazards. And each chemical has its own training requirements. A very common citation that most people do not train on is access to employee exposure and medical records. That's upon initial assignment and annually thereafter. Here again, bloodborne pathogens is an annual training. A lot of people miss that. Again, more chemicals. Here we have HAZCOM. Now, OSHA is planning an update to the HAZCOM GHS standard, and I'm certain that there will be an updated training component. Presently, training is required upon initial assignment anytime the hazards change, such as the introduction of a new chemical. I'm still finding safety data sheets that are not up to date and a lack of training documentation. So as you can see, there's a lot of regulations that require training, and we didn't even begin to look at the training requirements for the construction standard. So I hope that you found some of the tips that I've given you to be useful, and I believe they will help you prepare for an OSHA inspection. Don't forget the downloads that are provided with this webinar, as they could be of great assistance to you in preparation. In closing, I don't want to leave the impression that the intent of the information that I provided is meant to, quote, beat the system. By preparing for an OSHA inspection, what you're actually doing is improving workplace safety and health and ensuring that workers get to go home from dangerous jobs. Thank you for attending, and now on to Q&A.
Thanks, James. This is Diana. We have quite a few questions for you, and I'm going to kind of help you filter through those. And let me start with a question that came in from Paul, which I think you kind of answered. The question was, what is the most common cause for an OSHA audit? And I think I recall you saying it is due to an employee complaint. Is that correct?
Employee complaints. And many times OSHA gets these on a routine basis, and sometimes it just results in a letter, which you'll need to respond to. If you do not respond to that letter timely, that will trigger an OSHA inspection. If OSHA gets the employee complaint and deems it serious enough, that will trigger an OSHA inspection.
Great, thank you. Let's see, Brad wanted to know what if the top management is away at the corporate office when the OSHA shows up.
Then explain that to the compliance officer. If the top management can join by phone or by Zoom, that would be fantastic. I mean, people understand that larger organizations are spread out and your senior people may be in a corporate setting. But if they can participate using technology, I'd highly recommend that. Highly recommend that. Also, now, if they can't participate in the opening conference, then I highly recommend they be there for the closing conference.
All right. Another question from the audience. If OSHA says that they're there to inspect a certain area of the company and then later ask to tour other areas, do you have to comply?
You do not have to comply. And you can say to the inspector, hey, we got a programmed inspection here. We've got an inspection that's targeted. We need to stay within the realms of that and note your objections, okay? If you've got to reach out to the area office, you can do that as well. If it's something that's of a very serious nature, you feel strongly about it, then I highly advise you to get your attorney on the phone and seek legal counsel about the next steps. Now, you cannot use physical violence to restrain the OSHA inspector, right? But you can say we're not going to go there. That's not what the intent of this inspection is about. And you have a constitutional right against unreasonable search and seizure. At that point, if I felt strongly enough about it, and on advice of counsel, you could ask the inspector to leave and come back with a warrant if they wanted to search those other areas. Now, many people just assume that OSHA going to get a warrant is 100% guaranteed thing. Not necessarily so. Not necessarily so. So have a plan in place. Already know who your counsel is going to be if you have to deal with OSHA on that, and seek legal guidance if talking to the area director does not alleviate your concerns.
All right. Another question. How many employees do you have to fall under OSHA regulations?
Well, one, unless you're a sole proprietor. Now, if you want to get into reporting, requirements, that's different. But OSHA regulations apply to everybody that has an employee inside the United States and our territories.
Yeah, I think people often get confused with that recording requirement and thinking that means that they don't have to comply with OSHA if they have under 10 employees.
Absolutely.
Question regarding training. Did you say you need to have each and every one of the required training that you went through on the screen, whether it applies to your company or not, or only if that is applicable?
Only if it applies to your company or not. But what we find routinely is that many companies really are not training beyond the awareness level, if that. Their training is client driven instead of regulatory driven. So the best way to determine what type of training is required by OSHA is to use that publication, OSHA 2254, and create a training matrix based on the job task titles, the duties that people perform. And then inside that spreadsheet or training matrix, go through OSHA 2254 and list what is the required training for that particular position.
Also, on the topic of training, Juan would like to know, I know OSHA has a real pretty strong stance on this, is does the training have to be in a language that the employees understand or all in English?
It needs to be conducted according to OSHA in a language that employees understand and can comprehend. That's almost an exact quote. Mm-hmm. So if you have non-English speaking workers, or their English is poor and it could impact their comprehension, then you need to train them in whatever language that they can most understand in order to conform with the law.
Right. Nathan was wondering, due to COVID, does OSHA do any virtual inspections?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm not going to say that they don't, but that's one of the reasons that you saw the numbers for 2020 down around 20,000 inspections when we're usually running 35 to 40 inspections. I look all of that to change and even possibly get back to the Obama levels of 92,000 inspections. Again, many of those are employee complaints, but there's several national emphasis programs that are ongoing right now. And if you are in a high hazard field that involves one of those national emphasis programs, the likelihood of you being inspected has increased.
Back on the subject of training again, I know that this is an area that you're very familiar with. If employees are trained using SafeLand course, will that be sufficient to meet OSHA's training requirements in some of the areas that you presented?
Okay. In part, yes. In part, yes. If you're able to take, for example, some of the HAZCOM training that's included in SafeLand and add your company specific information to it, then that could be considered full training. But for the most part, SafeLand by itself is only going to meet the orientation and awareness level training and not meet the end user full training requirements of OSHA. As an instructor, I can't remember how many slides we have on fall protection, but certainly 7 or 8 slides about fall protection is not enough to put somebody in a harness and have them go work a loft. 12, 13 awareness level slides about confined space is not going to meet the training requirements for an entrant, attendant, or entry supervisor. So while that may be a minimum requirement from your hiring client, you still have a responsibility to comply with OSHA. And your MSA may not contain all the exact training requirements that you need. So I highly encourage you to utilize that OSHA publication 2254. It'll tell you exactly what you need to train on. It'll tell you exactly what the content needs to be and how to document it. And you should be okay.
And another question, I think it was Mike. Yeah, Mike wanted to know if Veriforce or Mariner Golf do offer any mock OSHA audits. I know Veriforce isn't really doing that. We're doing audits as a request of some of the operators, but is that something Mariner Gulf does, James?
No, we can. We're very experienced auditors, have an experienced audit team. We've all been through OSHA inspections. You know, we can be very detailed. Usually it's a 3 or 4 day process. If you want to reach out to me, my email is included with the slide presentation. Just send me an email and we'll be glad to talk to you about it.
Yes, and just as a reminder, and there were some comments here that we will be sending out the recording of this within 24 to 48 hours. So be looking for that. I'm not sure if this is a question or a statement, but David says when OSHA requires proof of training files, that involves sign-in sheets, etc. That is some of the proof that they would accept. Maybe copy tests, things of that nature.
Yes, sign-in sheets, and sometimes depending on which training requirement you look at, those sign-in sheets typically require instructor signatures, dates, things of that nature. What you normally put on a Veriforce PEC Learns roster, name, legible name, signatures that they've attended the class, start times and end times are recommended, but definitely the name of the instructor. If you have other documentation, like in your LMS or your written safety and health program, you'll want to provide that to the compliance officer as well, and that should suffice as training.
Well, I think we've gotten to most of the questions. We'll review these after the webinar, make sure we've answered everything. If we didn't, we'll get back to you. I said, Paul, you were asking about the cost of a mock audit. I would ask that you reach out to James after the webinar once we have you have his email address on that. Here's another last question before we run out of time. Scott asks if training from the Safety Council will be equivalent suffice for training requirements for employees. That's actually an area I'm very familiar with. And you know, when I think, Scott, when you're asking about training from the Safety Council, I assume you're referring to their basic orientation. There are safety councils do a lot of training. Some is more in-depth training that might qualify to meet the training requirements that James just went through. So I assume that you're talking about the basic orientation. James, I think the answer would be very similar to the answer you gave on behalf of SafeLand. Those classes are similar in length and nature in that they are awareness classes mostly.
Absolutely. For the most part, you're going to need to add your company's specific information to the training that may be conducted by the safety councils. You'll need to get the syllabus of what the training is, and I'm very familiar with the safety council's training, and in my opinion, most of it is not going to reach end-user full training. So depending on the topic, HAZCOM, for example, they're going to give you a general overview of HAZCOM, but you're required to train your people on the physical and health hazards associated with the chemicals that they're expected to use. So in that area, that's not going to be sufficient. My examples with fall protection, confined space, or just some forklift, material handling. It all depends on exactly what your job scopes are, but for the most part, awareness level training alone is not going to meet the OSHA required end user training, or what I call full training.
Well, all right. I want to thank everybody for participating and asking such great questions. And thank you, James, for all of your insight on this. Very, very informative. And I hope everybody else found it that way as well. Stay tuned for, we're doing these webinars monthly. And so we'll be announcing the next one shortly. It typically is last Tuesday of the month. And then also be on the lookout for our newsletter. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.